I've been slightly critical of George Lucas for, how shall we say, borrowing perhaps too much from the Dune series. But if I'm going to be consistent, he's not the only one. And the other George, George R.R. Martin, there are definitely large amounts of A Song of Ice and Fire that are very clearly influenced by Dune, with the Dothraki, of course, I like the Fremen, Bran with his psychic powers, feels a lot like Paul, right? He's also part of royalty. And you could go on and on. The Azor Ahai prophecy. There's a lot of clear parallels between the two stories. I'm not going to do entirely A Song of Ice and Fire here. I'm going to instead concentrate on Sand King, which also bears a lot of marks of Frank Herbert. I will say this, though, that I think this is the way you want to do the Dune influence. There is still, unfortunately, a lot to criticize, because George is actually pretty open about its influences. He talks about Tolkien, talks about Lovecraft, talks about a lot of people, but Frank Herbert does not come up a lot. And again, people forget, he began as a science fiction writer. Some of his earliest stuff was science fiction, and he's continued to do work in science fiction. And Dune has been a massive novel in science fiction, so it's really impossible to argue that he isn't aware or hasn't read Dune. The guy is a voracious reader. He clearly read Dune. And Sandkings does show bits and pieces of Dune, but I think it's done in a much more respectful and a much more intriguing manner. So this is going to be non-spoiler. I'm only going to hit some of the plot points without giving too much away. It's a relatively short story for George. It is, quote, long. You could call it a novella. What is the story with Sand? Well, essentially, it's a very Twilight Zone kind of framing where a man who is bored goes into a shop. This is set in some kind of murky future, but we don't know really when or where, and he wants something to distract himself. So he goes into this mysterious shop, and a woman basically offers him the Sand King, saying, "These are very interesting, marvelous creatures, and if you treat them right, they're going to perform for you very incredible things, including warfare." And that perks his ears. He says, "Oh, really? They're going to go to war?" "Yes, just be patient, follow these instructions. They will perform for you. They will even go to war for you, and you'll learn a lot from them." So he goes home. He gets bored and angry because they don't immediately start fighting one another. So, of course, he starts breaking the rules, starts poking at them, making them very, very aggressive. And, of course, it spirals steadily but slowly out of control. And he doesn't start off as an evil character, but definitely after a certain point, you're like, okay, that went way too far. It's not predictable. The ending is a very dark, very humorous ending, and it fits George's larger canon. It is very well written, but it's very generic. If you've read enough science fiction, it's nothing path-breaking. I give it a 7.25. It is very well done. It's very efficient. He doesn't waste time. The subplots and the major plot flow into each other nicely. And the Dune influence is very, very strong. It's a desert setting, and you can sort of see the warring houses metaphor. But instead of human houses, it's literally these alien ant things or spider creatures. Again, it's a very fascinating way he goes about it. Also, this does violate and go against Dune a little bit. Now, I want to be careful here. I do consider myself a Dune expert, but I don't know for sure if we do have aliens in the Dune universe. There's a lot of speculation we do have aliens, some speculation we don't have aliens. But in terms of the main story, we mostly deal with human beings. So technically there are no aliens, but you could argue by implication there are aliens. There are definitely aliens at the beginning of the Sand Kings. He makes that very, very clear. In fact, this is supposed to be a part of a larger universe. He just never followed up on it. So this is working with Dune in a lot of ways in the mythology, but in many ways he's going against it, because we clearly have kind of these alien creatures. It is focused mainly on human characters, and we do see a kind of Harkonian influence with the main protagonist. I wouldn't say he's as evil or sadistic as the Baron, but if you can kind of imagine Dune being read by the Baron Harkonnen as a piece of fiction, and him manipulating events by characters, that's kind of what you sense here. He's kind of making a argument about how humans think of themselves as gods and how they abuse the environment, right? A very strong ecological theme, and environmentalism, and how human beings mistreat the environment and then pay a huge price for it. So again, a lot of aspects of Frank Herbert, but he is making it his own thing. It's not as bad as Star Wars, but here I think it's legitimate borrowing. He is transforming enough elements so you can enjoy the story on its own terms. I will still say, though, it is very, very curious. He doesn't bring up Frank Herbert. He never really credits Frank Herbert. Doesn't talk about Frank Herbert all that much. So I'm like, that feels a little bit strange. Good story. I think it's very different from Star Wars, but yeah, a very Dune-ish kind of tale. Very good mix of horror and science fiction. Highly recommended. Unfortunately, I can't say too much about the Outer Limits adaptation. It is very, very different. I did like it, but it is really only taking little bits and pieces of the story and going on in its own direction. It really only shares the name. And the Sandkings do appear, but they work very, very differently. They do some superficial things with the story, but that's about it. It is a good Outer Limits episode. I would recommend it, but it's much, much weaker than the original story. I'd give that a 6.5. Still very enjoyable and watchable, but very, very different from the source material.